New York City. The year is 1931. The streets hum with the sound of distant traffic and whispered rumors. Somewhere in the haze of cigar smoke and neon light, a man walks between the worlds of law and lawlessness, neither a hero nor a villain, but something far more dangerous, a visionary. His name is Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and he will become the architect of modern organized crime, the man who turned the Mafia from a chaotic brotherhood of killers into a disciplined empire of power, profit, and silence. But before he was the boss of all bosses, he was just another immigrant kid hustling for survival in the dark underbelly of Manhattan's Lower East Side. This is not a story about guns and gang wars, it's about transformation, ambition, and the psychology of power. It's about how one man rewrote the rules of criminal enterprise, not through fear alone, but through intelligence, adaptability, and a deep understanding of human nature. To understand Luciano, we must understand the world that created him, a world of poverty and prejudice, of opportunity and oppression. In the early 1900s, millions of immigrants poured into America chasing the promise of freedom. But for many, that promise came wrapped in misery. On the Lower East Side, overcrowded tenements were breeding grounds for disease, despair, and desperation. For young Charles Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, the American dream was less about liberty and more about survival. He wasn't born into power. He took it piece by piece. From the first coin he extorted from a terrified boy on the street, to the alliances he forged with Jewish and Irish gangsters. Alliances that would break centuries of ethnic hostility, Luciano learned early that control was not given, it was built. Every handshake, every betrayal, every calculated risk became a step toward a new kind of power, one that would outlast bullets and prisons. The Mafia before him was a patchwork of warring clans, clinging to old-world codes that no longer fit the modern city. They fought over pride and blood, over meaningless traditions that cost lives and profits. Luciano saw something different. He saw the potential to run crime like a business, to replace chaos with order, to build a syndicate that could operate like a corporation, efficient, ruthless, invisible. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. About rewriting the rules of loyalty, hierarchy, and ambition. But there's another layer, the man behind the myth. Beneath the sharp suits and the cold stare was a mind shaped by insecurity and an obsession with respect. Luciano's rise wasn't only driven by greed, it was fueled by a lifelong hunger to be recognized, to be untouchable in a world that treated men like him as disposable. Every decision, every betrayal, every alliance, was a reflection of that inner drive. The boy who came from nothing, determined to rule everything. In this story, power doesn't come from violence alone. It comes from vision. It comes from understanding people's fears, their greed, their pride, and using those to your advantage. Luciano mastered that art like few ever have. To the public he was a monster. To his peers he was a genius. To historians he remains both. The criminal who thought like a statesman, the outlaw who built an empire so enduring that its structure still defines organized crime a century later. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano became the Godfather before there ever was one. How he turned an empire of shadows into a legacy of order. How his ideas transcended crime itself, bleeding into business, politics, and even popular culture. It's a story about the seduction of power, how it elevates and corrupts, builds and destroys. Because when you strip away the headlines, the violence, the myth, what remains is a man who understood something fundamental about human nature, that people don't follow laws or morals. They follow power. And Lucky Luciano for a time was power itself. Over the next 2 decades he would rise from the gutters to the penthouses, from street fights to world wars. He would unite enemies, command armies of criminals, and manipulate even the American government. But every empire built on fear eventually turns inward. Every king who believes himself untouchable eventually learns the cost of control. The story begins here, not with a bullet, not with a crime, but with a question that echoes through every generation of power: how far would you go to never be powerless again? At the turn of the 20th century, New York City was a beast growing faster than anyone could control, a roaring, restless jungle of steel, smoke, and ambition. Millions of immigrants poured into its heart, carrying nothing but hope and hunger. The American dream shimmered like a mirage across the skyline, but in the crowded alleys of Mulberry Street, Hester, and the Lower East Side, that dream curdled into something else: survival at any cost. Crime in this era was not yet a system. It was chaos, raw, unrefined, and tribal. Power belonged to whoever had the most muscle, the sharpest blade, or the nerve to kill first. The Mafia, as it would later be known, was still fractured into dozens of small Sicilian clans, each fiercely loyal to their own village, their own family, and their own code of silence. They brought with them the traditions of the old country, the omerta, the blood oath, and the idea that honor meant everything even above life itself. But in America, those old rules collided with a new reality: capitalism without conscience. The early 1900s Mafia world was dominated by men known as the Mustache Petes, old-school Sicilian bosses who clung to their heritage and distrusted outsiders. They believed power should stay in the hands of pure Sicilians, men who spoke the language, observed the rituals, and answered only to their countrymen. For them, crime wasn't a business, it was a bloodline. They controlled small neighborhoods, shaking down local merchants, extorting protection money, and settling disputes through assassinations that spilled blood in broad daylight. But New York was changing faster than they could. The city's underworld was no longer a Sicilian affair. It was a mosaic of gangs divided by ethnicity and ambition. The Irish controlled the docks and political machines through Tammany Hall. The Jewish mobs dominated gambling, labor unions, and the black markets. The Italians fought for scraps of power between them. Everyone was hustling, everyone was hungry, and alliances were fleeting. The police were underpaid and easily bribed. Judges could be bought, politicians rented. It was a perfect storm for corruption, and for the kind of man who could see order in chaos. Prohibition was still years away, but the groundwork was already being laid for a new kind of criminal economy. Saloons operated under the eyes of bribed officers, brothels thrived in the shadows of tenements, and opium dens filled the night with the scent of forbidden smoke. Every vice had a price. Every street had an owner. Yet there was no unity, no structure, no vision. Crime, as it existed before Luciano, was reactive, small-time racketeering fueled by greed and survival, not by ambition or strategy. The Mustache Petes enforced their dominance through fear. They despised modernization. Telephones, automobiles, even new business methods were beneath them. Their world was one of whispers, secret handshakes, and narrow loyalties. They refused to work with non-Italians, seeing the Jews and Irish as inferior and untrustworthy. But that old-world pride blinded them to what the next generation was learning: that money didn't care about bloodlines. Profit was the new loyalty. In this fractured underworld, one name ruled above all others before Luciano's rise: Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masuria. He was a crude, ruthless man, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, who demanded tribute from every Italian gangster in New York. His leadership was built not on respect but on intimidation. Those who defied him disappeared. Those who obeyed him were kept on a leash. Under Masuria's watch, gang wars were constant, profits were divided poorly, and innovation was stifled. It was a kingdom ruled by fear and ignorance. Across the East River in Brooklyn, another contender was emerging: Salvatore Maranzano, a rival Sicilian with a more refined demeanor but an equally archaic vision. He saw himself as a Roman emperor, organizing his followers like legions. Both men believed themselves destined to rule New York's underworld, and both underestimated the quiet, ambitious younger generation forming beneath them. Men who didn't want to inherit a broken system but to rebuild it entirely. Meanwhile, the city's streets were laboratories of survival. Young men like Charles Luciano learned early how to navigate between violence and opportunity. The gangs were training grounds, crude versions of what would later become corporate structures. There were the Five Points Gang, Eastman Gang, and smaller cliques that ruled each block with their own codes. Luciano, barely in his teens, would have seen firsthand how leadership worked, through charisma, calculation, and controlled brutality. Outside, America was entering an age of industrial revolution and excess. Wall Street boomed while the poor drowned in tenement sweat. The newspapers called it progress, but for the immigrant masses, it was exploitation, and crime became one of the few routes to dignity. The underworld was the mirror image of the legitimate world. Businessmen wore suits and stole in boardrooms. Gangsters wore the same suits and stole in alleys. The line between them was thinner than society wanted to admit. It was a time before the Mafia was organized, before the commission, before order. Blood feuds could start over insults. Families could be wiped out over territory no larger than a few city blocks. Yet beneath the chaos, a pattern was beginning to form, the faint outlines of something that resembled structure. The next generation watched, learned, and waited. Into this volatile world stepped a young immigrant with the sharpness of a survivor and the vision of a strategist. Charles "Lucky" Luciano didn't see honor in the old codes or pride in ethnic loyalty. He saw inefficiency. To him, the Mustache Petes were dinosaurs, men too blinded by the past to control the future. Where they saw bloodlines, he saw potential partnerships. Where they saw risk, he saw opportunity. And where they saw crime as survival, he saw crime as an industry. The world before Luciano was a battlefield without order, a storm of ambition without a compass. What he would do next was unthinkable for his time. Unite enemies, restructure crime, and create a network so powerful that even the U.S. government would one day turn to it for help. But in 1910's New York, that future was just a shadow on the horizon. The streets still belonged to the old guard, men who killed for pride and ruled by fear. What they didn't know was that their time was ending. A new kind of boss was coming, one who would trade superstition for strategy and blood oaths for board meetings. And when he finally rose, nothing in America, not crime, not business, not even politics, would ever be the same again. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, a small, sun-baked Sicilian village where survival was as much about pride as it was about bread. Life there was hard, rigid, and ruled by unwritten laws older than the kingdom itself. Men lived by honor, vengeance, and silence, the omerta. In that world, reputation meant life and disrespect demanded blood. But to a boy with restless eyes and a hunger for something larger than his narrow hillside town, Sicily felt like a cage. When his father decided to seek a better life across the ocean, young Salvatore followed, unaware that the streets awaiting him in America would be harsher, louder, and infinitely more dangerous. When the Lucania family arrived in New York around 1906, the myth of the American dream collided with the grim reality of the Lower East Side. The family crammed into a cold-water flat, sharing space with rats and other desperate souls. Work was scarce, food was scarce, and hope was scarcer. His father found labor as a bricklayer, earning pennies for back-breaking hours. His mother worked long nights sewing garments for the sweatshops. For them, America was survival. But for young Charles, as he soon began calling himself, it was a challenge. He learned English in the streets, not in school. By the time he was 10, he'd already figured out the laws of the neighborhood. If you can't be the strongest, be the smartest. If you can't fight your way out, think your way out. The Lower East Side was a crucible where nationalities mixed like volatile chemicals, Irish, Jewish, Italian, each group forming its own little army. Turf wars were constant and respect was everything. It didn't take long for Luciano to realize that school couldn't teach him what he needed to know. He dropped out around 14 trading textbooks for street corners. He joined the 5 Points Gang, one of the most notorious crews in New York, run by the Italian-American boss Paul Kelly, born Paolo Vaccarelli. Under Kelly's leadership, the gang was unlike the crude, chaotic mobs of the Mustache Pete's. Kelly taught discipline, strategy, and the art of negotiation. He demanded his men dress sharply, think tactically, and use words before weapons. It was in Kelly's shadow that Luciano received his first education in real power, not the power of brute force but of influence. He learned how to read people, how to play friend and enemy simultaneously, and how to use favors like currency. Every street, every deal, every betrayal became a lesson in psychology. Luciano was not the biggest or the most violent kid, but he had something far more dangerous: the ability to see 3 moves ahead. He made money however he could: gambling, running errands, and, before long, extortion. One of his earliest hustles became legend, charging neighborhood kids a few cents for protection from beatings, and if they didn't pay, he'd make good on the threat himself. It was cruel, but it was also business. Even as a teenager, Luciano understood that control and fear were commodities. People didn't pay him because they wanted to, they paid because it made them feel safer, a lesson that would echo through the rest of his life. During these early years, fate introduced him to the men who would define his rise. Meyer Lansky, the quiet, analytical Jewish kid with a mathematical mind, met Luciano when the two were still in their teens. Their first encounter, according to legend, happened during a street dice game that ended in confrontation, not violence. Luciano saw in Lansky something rare: intelligence without ego, loyalty without weakness. They became friends and later partners, an alliance that crossed ethnic lines and defied every old Mafia taboo. Then came Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, volatile, charismatic, and fearless, the fire to Lansky's ice. Together, the three formed an unholy trinity of ambition: Luciano the strategist, Lansky the financier, Siegel the enforcer. They weren't just street kids anymore. They were the nucleus of a new generation that saw crime not as a family feud, but as an opportunity for expansion. By his late teens, Luciano was already climbing. He wore tailored suits bought from his winnings, frequented cabarets, and rubbed shoulders with men twice his age. But his ambition also drew him into danger. Arrests became frequent: robbery, assault, drug possession. Each stint in jail was another lesson, each cellmate another contact. In one early arrest, he learned how the police operated, how the system could be manipulated. Jail didn't scare him, it educated him. Around this time, he also earned his infamous nickname, Lucky. Stories differ about how he got it. Some say it was because of his uncanny luck at surviving assassination attempts. Others claim it was for his skill at gambling. But the most famous tale comes from 1929, when Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on Staten Island. He survived, scarred and shaken but alive. From that day he was Lucky Luciano. Whether by fate or cunning, he seemed untouchable. But the transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The attack changed him. Before, he had been ambitious. After, he became calculating. He stopped trusting anyone completely. He learned to hide emotion behind a calm, unflinching stare. Pain had refined him into something colder, sharper, more deliberate. He would no longer rely on brute force or blind loyalty, he would rely on systems, strategy, and silence. Luciano also understood the power of image. He spoke English fluently, dressed like a Wall Street banker, and carried himself like a businessman, not a thug. He was the first of his kind, a gangster who could navigate both the underworld and the upper echelons of New York society. He frequented nightclubs where politicians, actors, and bootleggers mingled, learning how power really worked, through charm, favors, and compromise. By the 1920s, Prohibition was transforming the criminal landscape, and Luciano saw opportunity everywhere. But even before bootlegging made him rich, his core philosophy had taken root. Crime could be efficient, organized, and professional. He didn't want to be a killer, he wanted to be a king. The world had given him nothing, no wealth, no privilege, no second chances. But it had given him something more valuable, clarity. He knew the rules of survival and he knew how to bend them. Every man had a price. Every system could be bought. And every power structure, from the street gangs to City Hall, could be infiltrated and controlled. From a boy in the gutters of Palermo to a young man commanding respect in the streets of Manhattan, Luciano's rise wasn't just about ambition. It was about vision, the realization that the future didn't belong to those who waited for permission. It belonged to those who took it. And as he stood on the threshold of the 1920s, a decade of money, chaos, and opportunity, Lucky Luciano was ready to take it all. The world had underestimated him for the last time. The 1910s and early 1920s were Luciano's crucible, the years that forged his philosophy, his psychology, and his ruthless precision. If his childhood on the Lower East Side had taught him survival, this period taught him mastery. It was a time of transformation, when he evolved from a street hustler into a strategist. Each decision he made, each betrayal he witnessed, became another brick in the foundation of his empire to be. By his early 20s, Luciano was already well connected. His reputation as a shrewd earner caught the attention of the old Italian bosses, including Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, the self-proclaimed ruler of New York's underworld. Masuria was crude, violent, and proud, a remnant of the old Sicilian way. But Luciano saw in him an opportunity, proximity to power. He joined Masuria's crew not out of loyalty, but out of calculation. Under Joe the Boss, he learned the intricate politics of organized crime, how alliances were formed, how enemies were made, and how fragile power could be when built on fear. Still, the world was shifting. Prohibition had turned petty criminals into millionaires overnight. The 18th Amendment, enacted in 1920, outlawed the sale and transport of alcohol, a moral crusade that accidentally created the greatest black market in American history. Liquor became gold, and bootlegging became the new oil industry. The streets of New York ran with whiskey and blood. Every gang, from the Irish mob to the Jewish syndicates, fought for control of this lucrative new trade. Luciano, ever the visionary, saw something that others didn't. While most mobsters treated Prohibition as a get-rich-quick scheme, he saw it as the blueprint for a lasting empire. He realized that crime could be industrialized, organized with supply chains, distribution networks, and partnerships that mirrored legitimate corporations. He understood logistics, territory, and trust, the business side of vice. His partnership with Meyer Lansky deepened during this time. Lansky was the numbers man, the financial brain. Together, they created a distribution system that moved illegal liquor efficiently through New York's nightclubs and speakeasies. Luciano provided muscle and connections. Lansky provided intelligence and discretion. They ran their operation with the precision of accountants and the discipline of generals. Their model became the foundation for how organized crime would operate for decades to come. It was also during this time that Luciano learned the true meaning of diplomacy. Unlike the Mustache Pete's, he wasn't bound by Sicilian tradition. He was willing to work with anyone, Irish, Jewish or otherwise, as long as they made money and kept their word. This mindset was revolutionary. He formed quiet alliances with powerful figures like Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish gambler and businessman often referred to as the Godfather of American organized crime. Rothstein was polished, educated, and visionary. He taught Luciano the value of patience, how to think beyond the next score, how to view crime not as chaos but as commerce. Rothstein's influence was transformative. He introduced Luciano to the upper tiers of corruption, politicians, bankers, and Wall Street men who dined with criminals and pretended not to notice. Luciano learned that true power wasn't on the street, it was in the handshake behind closed doors. The rich didn't need guns, they had influence. He began to model himself after them, dressing in tailored suits, speaking eloquently, and moving through the city's elite social circles with calculated ease. But his education came at a cost. The streets were still violent and betrayal was constant. Rival gangs battled for control of bootlegging routes. Police raids were frequent. Friends disappeared overnight. Luciano himself was arrested several times during these years, mostly for minor offenses. But each time he walked free. He knew who to pay, who to threaten, and when to stay silent. The system, he realized, was as corrupt as the men who defied it, and he could play it better than anyone. One of the most defining events of his early career came in 1929, when he was kidnapped, beaten, and left for dead by unknown assailants. He was found barely alive, his face slashed, his body bruised, and his spirit altered forever. The incident would become legend, and his transformation complete. The man who emerged from that ordeal was not the same. Gone was the ambitious street hustler. In his place stood a cold strategist, a man who no longer believed in luck, only control. That brutal night taught him the essential lesson that would define his life. Vulnerability was death. Emotion was weakness. Trust was currency, to be traded, never given. From that point on, Luciano moved like a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always anticipating betrayal before it happened. His enemies thought they had scarred him. In reality, they had forged him. Luciano's inner circle during this period was a reflection of his evolving philosophy. Frank Costello, suave and politically connected, became his link to City Hall. Costello bribed politicians, fixed elections, and turned the law into a business partner. Lansky and Siegel managed the money and the muscle. Together they were more than criminals, they were architects of a new order. Each man brought a unique skill, and Luciano orchestrated them with precision. By the late 1920s, he had become indispensable to both the Italian and Jewish mobs. He was respected, feared, and increasingly seen as the bridge between old-world traditions and the new-world criminal capitalism. The Mustache Pete's dismissed him as too Americanized, too modern, but they couldn't deny his results. He was making more money, commanding more loyalty, and showing a vision none of them possessed. Yet beneath the surface of his success, Luciano's mind was restless. He saw the limitations of the old system, endless wars, petty rivalries, and bosses too stubborn to evolve. He began to dream of something radical, a unified underworld governed not by heritage or superstition, but by profit and structure. An organization that could settle disputes without violence, distribute territories efficiently, and handle business like a corporation. It would be, in essence, a government of crime. Every lesson he'd learned, from Paul Kelly's discipline, Rothstein's intellect, Lansky's logic, and Masuria's arrogance, was converging into a singular vision. Luciano no longer wanted to be a gangster. He wanted to be a leader, the architect of a system that would outlast any man. His education was complete. The streets had taught him ruthlessness. The mentors had taught him patience. And the betrayals had taught him clarity. Now all he needed was the right moment, the perfect storm, to seize control. That storm was coming. The old bosses were about to go to war, and Luciano would be standing in the middle, not as a victim but as the one pulling the strings. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had become something rare in the world of organized crime. A man who understood that rules, even in the underworld, could be tools of power. Every empire needs a system, every system needs loyalty, and every loyalty needs a code. For the Mafia, that code was omerta, the sacred vow of silence, secrecy, and obedience that bound men tighter than blood. But under Luciano's watch, that ancient Sicilian creed evolved. He didn't just inherit the code of omerta, he reinvented it. To understand how Luciano ruled, one must first understand what omerta truly meant. In the old Sicilian sense, it was more than silence, it was survival. It meant you never spoke to outsiders, especially not to the police. It meant you handled your own problems within the family even if it cost lives. It meant that betrayal, in any form, was punishable by death. This was not merely a rule, it was a religion. A man who broke omerta didn't just betray his brothers, he desecrated something sacred. For the mustache Petes, the old-world bosses, omerta was rigid and ceremonial. It demanded blind loyalty to the Don and unquestioning obedience. The family came first, above wives, children, or country. Men were expected to live and die by this code without hesitation. But this old version of omerta also made the Mafia inflexible, limiting its reach in a world that was modernizing rapidly. It created hierarchy, not efficiency. Tradition, not innovation. Luciano saw the flaw. Blind loyalty made men predictable. Predictable men were easy to control but also easy to destroy. He understood that power wasn't maintained through fear alone, it had to be sustained through mutual benefit. If the old code demanded loyalty through honor, his version would demand loyalty through profit. He transformed omerta from a religious vow into a business contract, still sacred but transactional. Under Luciano, silence wasn't just about not talking, it was about maintaining the illusion of unity. He knew the real threat to any organization wasn't the enemy outside, but dissent within. So he created a culture where loyalty was rewarded, betrayal was punished swiftly, and discretion was absolute. Talk too much, die fast, that was the unspoken rule. His men didn't follow him out of fear of death alone, they followed him because loyalty paid. Those who stayed quiet, those who played their part, were rewarded with money, territory, and respect. He turned fear into incentive, and that made his system unbreakable. Luciano also understood psychology. He knew that in the underworld, everyone wanted to feel important. Everyone wanted to belong. So he created roles, ranks, and symbols of power: boss, underboss, consigliere, capo regime, soldier, a hierarchy modeled after military efficiency and corporate order. Everyone had someone to answer to and everyone knew their place. The code of omerta became not just moral doctrine but structural glue. It made the organization self-sustaining. At its core, this system relied on two opposing emotions: fear and respect. Fear kept men obedient, respect kept them loyal. Luciano knew the balance. Too much fear bred rebellion. Too much familiarity bred weakness. So he cultivated an image that walked the line: approachable but unchallengeable, personable but untouchable. He'd share a drink with a soldier one day, then order his execution the next if that soldier stepped out of line. The message was clear: in this world, loyalty wasn't a choice, it was survival. But there was a deeper layer to the code that made it psychologically brilliant. Omerta wasn't just about silence, it was about identity. It gave men from broken homes, immigrant families, and violent streets a sense of belonging. It filled the void that poverty, racism, and social rejection had carved into their lives. The Mafia became their family, their validation. To betray it wasn't just treachery, it was self-destruction. Luciano understood this profoundly. He knew how to make men feel seen, useful, and indispensable, right up until they weren't. Yet, beneath the order, paranoia thrived. In a world built on silence, no one could ever be sure who was truly loyal. Luciano's brilliance lay in turning that paranoia into discipline. The fear of being watched kept everyone sharp. The fear of punishment kept them efficient. In this way, omerta became not only a code but a mechanism of control, psychological handcuffs that no one dared to remove. Luciano's manipulation of the code also extended beyond his own men. He used the same principles to build alliances across ethnic lines. With the Jewish and Irish mobs, there was no omerta, but there was trust built on the same foundation: profit and discretion. He treated partners like equals, which earned him respect from men like Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz, who were used to being dismissed by old-school Italians. Luciano replaced the Sicilian pride of exclusion with a modern creed of collaboration. The contrast between old and new couldn't have been sharper. The old bosses clung to rituals, whispered oaths before saints, blood pricks on fingers, ancient words of loyalty. Luciano kept the ceremony but stripped it of mysticism. To him, the ceremony was just theater, useful for inspiring devotion but meaningless without results. What mattered was efficiency, profit, and silence. Everything else was sentiment. The transformation was subtle but revolutionary. The Mafia under Luciano's code became less about family bloodlines and more about structure. It wasn't a gang anymore, it was an institution. Each family operated like a department in a corporation, each boss like a CEO. The commission, which Luciano would later establish, was simply omerta scaled up. The code turned into governance. Of course, No system can thrive without fear of consequence, and Luciano's enforcement of omerta was absolute. When someone broke silence, they vanished, quietly, efficiently. The punishment wasn't public spectacle, it was surgical. To outsiders, it looked as though traitors simply disappeared. To insiders it was a reminder: talk once, die once. Luciano's psychological mastery was evident even in how he spoke about loyalty. "There's no such thing as good men or bad men," he reportedly said. "There's only smart men and stupid men." To him, betrayal wasn't a moral failure, it was bad business. And men who endangered the business didn't deserve a second chance. What made his version of omerta endure wasn't just the brutality, it was its logic. It appealed to greed, fear, and belonging all at once. It offered stability in an unstable world. It promised identity to men who had none. It gave purpose to criminals who'd spent their lives reacting, not planning. Luciano taught them to think, to strategize, to move like businessmen, and that made them far more dangerous than any gang of street killers. The irony, of course, was that the very code designed to protect him would later seal his fate. Omerta demanded silence, even when the world turned against him. When the law closed in, he could never speak in his defense without breaking the very rule that had built his empire. The code was his crown, and his cage. But in this moment, in the height of his reign, omerta was his masterpiece. Through it, Lucky Luciano achieved what centuries of gangsters could not. He made crime stable, organized, and self-perpetuating. He gave the underworld a moral system, one that replaced chaos with structure and emotion with logic. It was the psychology of control disguised as honor. The art of silence turned into an empire. And for years no one would dare to break it. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had become more than a gangster. He was a CEO in a criminal world that now operated like a multinational enterprise. The streets of New York were no longer ruled by random violence or petty rackets. They were managed through systems, partnerships, and profits. Under his vision, the Mafia wasn't about bloodshed anymore, it was about business. Every illegal operation had to serve a purpose, feed a network, and generate revenue. Luciano had turned crime into capitalism. It all began with one realization: violence draws attention, business sustains power. In a world where blood on the pavement attracted police, newspapers, and moral crusaders, Luciano saw something that his rivals did not: discretion was profit. He wanted a criminal economy so vast and invisible that it could function like Wall Street, but without regulation or taxes. And to do that, he had to control the city's underground industries, from vice to labor, from gambling to unions. One of Luciano's first great innovations was to treat illegal trades like legitimate supply chains. He understood logistics, markets, and human desire. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, these weren't vices to him, they were commodities. "People always want what they can't have," he once remarked, and that simple observation became the cornerstone of his empire. He began with prostitution, one of the city's oldest underground trades but one riddled with chaos. Pimp wars, street fights, police raids, the system was messy and inefficient. Luciano applied business logic. He organized brothels into districts, standardized prices, and established a hierarchy of madams and collectors who paid weekly fees, essentially a franchise model for vice. The women were protected, the clients were consistent, and the profits rolled in smoothly. What was once a dangerous, fragmented trade became a streamlined operation under his supervision. Next came gambling, the golden artery of organized crime. Numbers rackets, bookmaking, and illegal casinos were thriving, but again disunity limited their reach. Luciano and his associates, men like Meyer Lansky, the financial brain of the operation, restructured it. They invested in gambling dens that ran quietly under legitimate fronts: cigar shops, social clubs, and restaurants. They created layers of protection, ensuring that if one link broke, the rest survived. Every game, every bet, every dice roll was a calculation of risk and profit, just like stocks. Then came labor racketeering, the most brilliant and far-reaching of Luciano's ventures. He realized that America's labor unions were a gold mine of untapped power. Whoever controlled the docks, the trucks, and the warehouses controlled the arteries of commerce. Through intimidation and persuasion, Luciano's men embedded themselves in the unions, particularly the longshoremen and the trucking industries. They offered protection from rival gangs and corrupt officials, while in reality, they were the ones orchestrating both. This move gave Luciano something far more valuable than cash: influence over legitimate businesses. By controlling who worked, who shipped, and who got paid, he could make or break companies. Politicians couldn't move goods without union cooperation. union bosses couldn't act without Mafia approval. It was an invisible empire, operating beneath the surface of American capitalism, and Luciano was the unseen architect. The unions also offered a new kind of leverage, legitimacy. When authorities cracked down on gambling or prostitution, Luciano's legal fronts through union funds and construction firms gave him protection. Dirty money became clean money. Criminals became labor leaders. He blurred the line between crime and commerce so thoroughly that for many businessmen, paying the Mafia became as routine as paying taxes. But Luciano's business acumen extended beyond the physical industries. He understood network economics, the value of partnerships. Together with Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, he forged alliances with Jewish and Irish mobsters, sharing territories and profits rather than fighting over them. This was revolutionary. Ethnic loyalty had always divided the underworld. Luciano replaced it with economic loyalty. Money doesn't care about your last name, he liked to say. Through this multi-ethnic cooperation, Luciano helped pioneer what was essentially a national syndicate, a coalition of organized crime families that worked like a federation. They shared intelligence, divided markets, and enforced agreements through the commission, a body Luciano himself would later formalize. Every racket, every illegal trade was now part of a unified network. Meanwhile, the money flowed in rivers. Bootlegging profits from prohibition had been reinvested into nightclubs, racetracks, and Hollywood connections. Smuggling routes from Cuba and Canada fed narcotics into New York, and Luciano's men handled every stage: import, distribution, sales. Everything had a chain of command, every link a cost and a profit margin. It wasn't crime, it was logistics, economics, and psychology rolled into one. He was also among the first to see the potential of Las Vegas long before it became the gambling capital of the world. While Bugsy Siegel would later be the face of the Flamingo, the seed of that idea, turning gambling into luxury, making crime look glamorous, came from Luciano's vision. Why hide crime in the shadows when it could be disguised as entertainment? Luciano's transformation of the Mafia's business model also reshaped its internal culture. The new generation of gangsters, pragmatic, educated, ambitious, began to replace the old guard who clung to Sicilian traditions. Instead of dusty social clubs and back-alley meetings, deals were made in hotel lobbies and restaurants. Money replaced bloodlines, efficiency replaced sentiment. The Mafia was no longer a family of criminals, it was a criminal corporation. Behind the scenes, however, Luciano's system depended on a delicate balance of violence and diplomacy. To enforce order, he created a chain of command that ensured disputes were settled quietly. Instead of open warfare, conflicts were handled through negotiation or discreet elimination. Every hit was approved, every action calculated. His rule: never let blood spill without reason, and never let reason interfere with profit. This new world of organized crime mirrored corporate America in chilling ways. There were mergers, alliances, hostile takeovers, hits, and even board meetings, commission gatherings. Luciano had built a shadow version of capitalism, one that thrived on the same principles: competition, consolidation, and control. But perhaps Luciano's greatest contribution to the business of crime was his understanding of optics. He knew how to make crime look respectable. He wore tailored suits, frequented high-end restaurants, and mingled with politicians and celebrities. To the public, he wasn't a thug, he was a businessman, a man of influence. The media called him lucky, not just because of his escapes from death, but because everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. His criminal organization mirrored his personality: smooth, strategic, and relentlessly adaptive. When one racket came under scrutiny, another quietly expanded. When a politician grew too curious, he was either bribed or ruined. Luciano ran his empire like a chess grandmaster, always several moves ahead. However, with every empire built on secrecy and profit, cracks eventually appear. The same systems that made him powerful, brothels, unions, gambling networks, also made him vulnerable. The larger his operations grew, the more people knew his name. The more people knew, the harder it was to stay invisible. But for now, Luciano stood at the peak of his power. He had done what no gangster before him had accomplished. He made crime predictable. He turned chaos into order, greed into governance. The streets of New York, from the docks to the penthouses, all flowed through his invisible channels. The world called it organized crime. Luciano called it good business. What he didn't know was that in organizing the underworld so perfectly, he had also made it visible enough for the law to finally understand it, and to start plotting its destruction. Every empire, no matter how stable, eventually faces the test of loyalty. For Lucky Luciano, that test came not from the law but from within his own world, a world of allies who dreamed too big and enemies who refused to disappear. In the mid-1930s, as his organization flourished, the balance between partnership and betrayal became razor-thin. The Mafia was more unified than ever, yet beneath the surface cracks began to form, cracks born from greed, pride, and fear. Luciano's alliances had been his greatest strength. Men like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello were not just business partners, they were extensions of his vision. Lansky, the mathematical mind, managed finances and laundering. Costello, the diplomat, handled politicians and police. Together, they formed a triangle of power that could stabilize the entire underworld. But alliances that depend on ambition also breed resentment. And not every associate shared Luciano's sense of balance. Enter Dutch Schultz, volatile, brilliant, and dangerous. Schultz had made a fortune in bootlegging and the numbers racket, but his arrogance made him unpredictable. He wanted to assassinate Thomas E. Dewey, the fearless prosecutor who was threatening to dismantle organized crime. Dewey's investigations were tightening the noose around rackets across New York, and Schultz saw only one solution: kill him. Luciano disagreed. He understood that murdering a public figure like Dewey would bring the full weight of the U.S. government crashing down on all of them. It wasn't business, it was suicide. Schultz called Luciano weak, Luciano called Schultz reckless. The debate ended the way it always did in the Mafia, with a bullet. In 1935, on the orders of the Commission, the council Luciano himself had helped create, Dutch Schultz was assassinated in a Newark restaurant. It was a brutal but necessary act, one that showed how Luciano's empire maintained order, through collective discipline and silent ruthlessness. For the first time, organized crime had its own internal justice system. Luciano didn't just kill an enemy, he eliminated chaos. But with Schultz's death came unintended consequences. The public began to notice that mobsters were dying in suspiciously organized ways. Newspapers hinted at a shadow government in the underworld. Dewey himself, emboldened by public support, turned his full attention toward Lucky Luciano. The alliances that had kept him safe were now drawing attention, and enemies in powerful offices. Meanwhile, inside his own circle, ambition brewed quietly. Vito Genovese, Luciano's underboss, admired his boss's brilliance but craved his throne. Genovese was old school, violent, traditional, and territorial, everything Luciano had moved beyond. Where Luciano preferred strategy, Genovese preferred fear. He saw diplomacy as weakness, and every alliance as a threat to his eventual rise. Luciano could sense the tension. He kept his friends close, his rivals closer, and his secrets buried. His genius lay in reading people. He could see betrayal forming long before it happened. But even he couldn't control the shifting tides forever. As Dewey's investigations grew sharper and his inner circle expanded, the risk of exposure multiplied. And yet, even amid the paranoia, Luciano continued to expand. His allies in Chicago, men like Al Capone's successors Frank Nitti and Tony Accardo, looked to him for structure. The commission met regularly, arbitrating disputes and dividing territories. Under Luciano's influence, killings dropped, profits rose, and the Mafia achieved something no one thought possible: peace through organization. But peace in the underworld is an illusion. Every alliance carries a seed of betrayal, and every favor has a cost. Luciano's power was built on trust. Trust that could never truly exist in a world of killers and thieves. As law enforcement pressure mounted, as informants and rivals whispered in the dark, Luciano's empire began to feel the tremors of its own success. For every friend who stood by him, there was another waiting for him to fall. For every alliance that strengthened his hand, there was one that threatened to turn it against him. Luciano had built an empire out of loyalty, but in the end, it would be loyalty itself that undid him. By 1935, the calm that Lucky Luciano had built over years of negotiation and discipline began to unravel. The hidden war, the quiet conflict between the Mafia, law enforcement, and shifting loyalties, was now coming into full view. Luciano had created order in chaos, but that same order made him visible. His empire had become too large, too structured, and too profitable to ignore. And while the streets of New York looked peaceful, beneath them was a silent storm, a war fought not with bullets but with intelligence, informants, and fear. At the center of that storm was Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious special prosecutor who saw in Luciano the symbol of everything wrong with the American dream. Dewey wasn't just another lawman. He was a man building a political legacy. For him, taking down Lucky Luciano wasn't only about crime, it was about proving that no one, Not even the most powerful mobster in the country could escape justice. Luciano knew Dewey's type. He'd faced crooked cops and self-righteous politicians before, but Dewey was different. He was smart, incorruptible, and relentless. He didn't chase street thugs, he went straight for the men behind the curtain. The old ways of bribery and intimidation no longer worked. Dewey refused payoffs, ignored threats, and built his case methodically, piece by piece. The war began with whispers, raids on brothels, sudden arrests, and the quiet disappearance of Luciano's lower-level operators. Dewey's men were systematically targeting the vice network that Luciano had so carefully organized. Brothel madams, once fiercely loyal, were dragged into interrogation rooms and broken down under psychological pressure. Dewey's strategy was simple: dismantle Luciano's empire from the bottom up. What Luciano didn't anticipate was fear's power to unravel silence. For years, Omerta had protected him. No one dared speak his name. But now, faced with long prison sentences and public humiliation, some began to talk. Dewey's team found one woman willing to testify, Cokie Flo Brown, a madam who described Luciano as the mastermind behind New York's prostitution ring. Her testimony wasn't airtight, but it was explosive. The newspapers printed her words like gospel. Overnight, Luciano went from a shadowy figure to America's most wanted man. This wasn't a war fought with gang wars or street executions. It was a war of perception. Dewey used the press as his weapon. Headlines branded Luciano the Vice King of New York. Each front-page story eroded the aura of invincibility he had built. For the first time, Luciano's greatest shield, his invisibility, was shattered. Meanwhile, within the Mafia, paranoia began to spread. Every associate, every business partner was suddenly a potential liability. Men who had once spoken freely now avoided each other. Phones went silent. Safe houses filled with whispers and cigarette smoke. Luciano, usually calm under pressure, began moving constantly, from hotel to hotel, from one safe apartment to another. He dressed differently, traveled under aliases, and kept his meetings brief. But he wasn't running out of fear. He was strategizing. He knew that the war wasn't lost yet. He still had influence, money, and connections in law enforcement. He reached out quietly to friendly politicians, lawyers, and union bosses, trying to buy time to find cracks in Dewey's wall. Yet, the more he maneuvered, the tighter the net became. The commission, which had once been Luciano's proudest creation, began to turn cautious. No one wanted to be dragged down with him. Men like Frank Costello tried to keep operations steady, maintaining the illusion of business as usual. But others, especially Vito Genovese, started to see opportunity in Luciano's vulnerability. Genovese whispered that maybe it was time for new leadership, a return to old ways. The empire Luciano had built on cooperation was beginning to eat itself alive. Even as Dewey's campaign intensified, Luciano refused to show weakness. He threw lavish parties, attended nightclubs, and maintained his charm in public, as if daring the law to catch him. But behind closed doors he was losing sleep. His once iron circle of trust had begun to shrink to a few loyal men. In early 1936, the inevitable happened. Acting on a wave of arrests and witness statements, Dewey's task force raided one of Luciano's safe houses. Luciano barely escaped, fleeing New York under the cover of night. For weeks he moved from city to city, from Miami to Hot Springs, Arkansas, always one step ahead of the law. In Hot Springs he finally let his guard down, convinced that his political connections could protect him. But Dewey's reach extended further than Luciano imagined. With the help of local police, federal agents cornered him. The great Lucky Luciano, the man who had outsmarted rivals, wars, and betrayals, was finally caught in a quiet Arkansas hotel room. His arrest was a spectacle. Reporters mobbed the streets. Photographers captured his every glance. The newspapers painted him as the criminal mastermind of a generation, the puppet master behind America's moral decay. To the public he was no longer just a gangster. He was the face of evil. To his men he was still Charlie Lucky, the man who made them rich and powerful. But even they knew the tide had turned. In the months leading up to his trial, the hidden war shifted again, from the streets to the courtroom. Dewey had his prize. Luciano had his reputation. What followed would determine not only his fate but the future of organized crime itself. This was no longer about who controlled the rackets. It was about who controlled the story. The law had finally entered the arena Luciano thought he owned: strategy. And for the first time in his life he wasn't the one pulling the strings. When Lucky Luciano was finally brought back to New York in chains, it felt like the end of an era. The man who had once dined with senators and ruled the streets like a silent king now stood before flashing cameras, handcuffed and expressionless. For years he had been the invisible architect of organized crime, a name whispered in fear and admiration. Now he was a headline. His empire, built on silence and loyalty, was about to face the one enemy it could not bribe, threaten, or outthink: the law. The case against Luciano wasn't built on a single act of violence or theft. It was built on the very brilliance that made him powerful: organization. Dewey and his prosecutors didn't just see a gangster. They saw a system, a criminal corporation so vast that it touched every corner of New York's underground economy. And to destroy it, they would have to destroy its leader's myth. Luciano's indictment stunned the underworld. He was charged with compulsory prostitution, accused of running an empire of vice that exploited hundreds of women and generated millions in illegal profits. The evidence, much of it circumstantial and based on testimony from prostitutes and madams, was far from perfect. But Dewey didn't need perfection. He needed a spectacle. And in 1936, that's exactly what he created. As the trial began, the courtroom turned into a theater of morality. Dewey's team presented dozens of witnesses: women who described how they were forced into prostitution, pimps who testified about payoffs, and police officers who claimed Luciano's men controlled the brothels. The press devoured every word. Each headline painted Luciano as both a monster and a mastermind, a man who corrupted the very soul of New York. Luciano sat through it all with calm defiance. He wore sharp suits, kept his hair slicked, and refused to show emotion. To him, the courtroom was just another battlefield, one fought with words instead of bullets. But inside he knew the danger. The case wasn't just about his freedom, it was about his legacy. Dewey wasn't merely prosecuting a man. He was dismantling the mythology of Lucky Luciano, piece by piece. His lawyers fought hard, arguing that the witnesses were unreliable, criminals and addicts desperate for leniency. They painted Dewey's crusade as a political show trial designed to make him famous. And in many ways they were right. But the tide of public opinion had turned. The Great Depression had left Americans hungry for villains, and Luciano fit the role perfectly: a rich, foreign-born gangster exploiting the poor. In private moments, Luciano's confidence wavered. He knew omerta demanded silence, that no man should turn on his own. But as he watched one witness after another betray their oaths, he began to realize how fragile loyalty really was when faced with the threat of prison. Fear was spreading through his empire faster than bullets ever could. Men who had once sworn undying allegiance were cutting deals to save themselves. Frank Costello, always the diplomat, tried to stabilize the families. He assured everyone that Luciano's conviction wouldn't destroy the organization, that the commission would keep things running smoothly. But others saw an opportunity in his downfall. Vito Genovese, ever the patient predator, began whispering in dark corners, positioning himself for power should Luciano fall. For all his composure, Luciano could sense it: the invisible shifting of loyalties, the subtle cracks in the foundation he had built. The empire wasn't collapsing overnight, but it was changing. His absence, even temporary, would alter everything. And as the trial dragged on, Luciano began to see the truth. The system he had perfected was now working against him. After weeks of testimony and spectacle, the jury retired for deliberation. Luciano remained stoic, cigarette in hand, surrounded by lawyers and guards. When they returned, the verdict was swift: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters rushing to telephones, flashbulbs exploding. Dewey had done it. Lucky Luciano, the most powerful gangster in America, was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The words hung heavy in the air. 30 to 50 years. For a man used to commanding armies with a glance, it was a death sentence in slow motion. Yet Luciano didn't flinch. He straightened his tie, whispered something to his lawyer, and walked out with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through the underworld. But the look in his eyes, cold, unreadable, said everything. Behind him, the machine he had built began to recalibrate. Costello took control of the day-to-day operations, ensuring the family stayed united. The commission continued to meet, though with less authority and more fear. Luciano's empire still generated money, still controlled unions, still influenced politics. But without its architect, it lost its soul. Meanwhile, Dewey basked in victory. His triumph over Luciano made him a national hero, launching his career into the political stratosphere. To the public, it was a victory for justice. But to the men who lived in the underworld, it was the beginning of a new era. One where visibility could destroy you faster than bullets ever could. For Luciano, prison would be a new kind of battleground. It wasn't about surviving hits or managing territory anymore, it was about maintaining control from a cage. The law had taken his freedom, but it hadn't taken his influence. And as he settled into his cell, he began to plan the next move, not with guns but with patience. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't just a man's downfall, it was the closing of a chapter in American crime. The age of open gangland warfare had ended. In its place rose something colder, quieter, and infinitely smarter, an empire that no longer needed a face. Luciano was behind bars but his system lived on. And that was the cruel irony, the man who invented organized crime was now powerless to stop it from evolving without him. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a national performance. Every day the courtroom buzzed with reporters, photographers, and spectators eager to see the man the newspapers called the Lord High Executioner of Vice. Yet, beneath the glamour and gossip, it was a slow, methodical dismantling of a myth. A man who had ruled from the shadows was now being dissected in the light. As the summer of 1936 dragged on, Thomas E. Dewey emerged as a symbol of law and order. He spoke with calm authority, presenting Luciano not as a rogue criminal, but as a businessman of evil, the CEO of sin. He outlined in painstaking detail how Luciano's organization operated. The chain of command, the payments, the enforcement system, the franchise model of prostitution that turned New York's underworld into an industry. To the jury it sounded less like fiction and more like corporate documentation. Each witness added another crack in Luciano's armor. Some told stories of money envelopes being passed through layers of intermediaries, others of how fear kept everyone obedient. But the most damaging testimonies came from the women, the madams and prostitutes who spoke with emotion, sometimes trembling, sometimes defiant. Their stories painted Luciano not just as a criminal, but as a manipulator of lives. Whether their words were coached or coerced didn't matter anymore. The image was set. Luciano's defense team, sharp, articulate and well-funded, fought fiercely. They attacked Dewey's witnesses, exposing contradictions and exaggerations. They highlighted the lack of direct evidence tying Luciano personally to the brothels. He had never been caught giving an order, never been photographed with any of the witnesses, never even visited the scenes of the crimes. You can't convict a man for being successful, one lawyer thundered. But Dewey was too skilled to let logic interfere with narrative. He reminded the jury that power itself was the evidence. This man doesn't need to give orders directly, Dewey declared in his closing argument. His power is in the fear he commands. His word is law. His silence an order. It was brilliant rhetoric, the transformation of invisibility into guilt. The public devoured every detail. Newspapers ran serialized courtroom accounts, radio broadcasts covered Dewey's cross-examinations, and gossip columns described Luciano's every gesture. His tailored suits, his calm demeanor, his occasional smirk, all became part of his legend. Some admired his composure, calling him the last gentleman gangster. Others saw it as arrogance. Either way, Luciano had become a cultural symbol, a dark reflection of ambition in Depression-era America. In truth, Luciano viewed the entire spectacle with cold calculation. He knew Dewey's showmanship couldn't be countered by mere facts. What he underestimated was how much America wanted to believe in justice, in the idea that one righteous man could bring down the devil. When the verdict finally came on June 18, 1936, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on 62 counts, the foreman announced. The words echoed like gunfire. Luciano's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He didn't protest. He simply nodded once, the gesture of a man who knew that his fate had already been sealed long before the jury entered the room. 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man in his late 30s, it might as well have been life. The judge's words were sharp and moralizing. This defendant has debased women, corrupted men, and mocked the law. His imprisonment will be a lesson that no man is above justice. Dewey stood nearby, expression unreadable, knowing he had made history. Outside, crowds cheered. Reporters rushed to file their stories. For the first time, the government had successfully convicted one of America's criminal elites. To the press, it was a victory for democracy, to politicians it was a validation of power. But for the underworld it was an earthquake. Back in his cell that night, Luciano lit a cigarette and stared at the walls. The smell of disinfectant and cold stone filled the air. For the first time in years there were no phone calls to make, no men to command. Just silence. Yet even in defeat his mind was moving. He knew that as long as his system lived, he could still pull strings from behind the bars. His empire adjusted quickly. Frank Costello stepped into the political and business aspects, managing gambling operations and union deals. Meyer Lansky continued laundering money and investing in legitimate fronts. The commission, now fully autonomous, kept the machine running. They visited Luciano, took orders discreetly, and passed information back and forth. From the outside, it looked as if he had vanished. From the inside, he was still the brain. His name became taboo in newspapers, but sacred in the underworld. Even locked away, Luciano's authority carried weight. Charlie says, became a phrase of decision, final and unquestioned. But the trial left scars that could not be erased. It shattered the illusion that the Mafia was untouchable. It exposed their structure, their rules, and their reach. Every ambitious gangster now knew that power could end in handcuffs. And yet, the irony was cruel. While Dewey had imprisoned one man, he had legitimized the idea of organized crime in the public imagination. The Mafia, once a rumor, was now a certified institution in the American psyche. For Luciano, the months following his sentencing were filled with reflection. He had outsmarted men with guns, politicians with ambition, and enemies with greed, but not time. The trial had proven something deeper, that even in a world built on silence, the truth could find its voice. In the end, Dewey's victory wasn't just about law. It was about symbolism. The trial had redefined the boundaries between power and morality, showing that even the most disciplined empire could crumble under exposure. Yet Luciano's calm acceptance hinted at something the law could never truly imprison: his mind. He had lost the battle for freedom but not the war for influence. Behind those steel bars, Lucky Luciano began to plan, not revenge but adaptation. Because if prison was to be his new kingdom, then he would rule it as he had ruled the streets, quietly, efficiently, and with absolute control. Prison, for most men, is a place where power ends. But for Lucky Luciano, it became a different kind of throne room. Smaller, colder, quieter, yes, but still a place from which an empire could be commanded. His sentence of 30 to 50 years at Clinton Correctional Facility might have looked like the end of an era. In reality, it was the start of a new chapter, one that proved that real power doesn't need freedom, only loyalty and fear. Luciano arrived at Clinton in upstate New York like a king fallen from grace. The tabloids splashed photos of him in handcuffs, headlines screaming "Vice King behind bars." But the guards noticed something curious. Luciano didn't act like a broken man. He moved with the same quiet authority he had on the streets, respectful, calm, and calculating. He never raised his voice, never begged, never lost composure. It was as if he'd simply changed office locations. Almost immediately, he adapted to the rhythms of prison life. He learned the schedules, memorized the guards' habits, and mapped the power structure inside. In prison, just like on the outside, there were hierarchies, and Lucky understood hierarchies better than anyone. Cigarettes, favors, protection, information, these became currency. And Luciano, even behind bars, had more currency than anyone. His old allies ensured that money kept flowing. From the outside, Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello handled the gambling operations, ensuring Luciano's cut reached his hands discreetly. Bribes were paid. Guards were softened. Little by little, he began to reshape his environment. Soon, he had privileges most inmates couldn't even imagine. Better food, cleaner clothes, special visits, whispered conversations through carefully chosen intermediaries. More importantly, his words still carried weight on the streets. Messages went out through lawyers, coded letters, or trusted visitors. Charlie says, the phrase that once guided the Mafia Commission continued to echo across New York's underworld. If someone needed permission to make a move, to take over a racket, or to solve a problem, they still sought Luciano's blessing. His physical absence did not equal silence. It simply made his voice sound more distant, more mythic. The men running the commission never forgot who had built the system they now profited from. Luciano had given them structure, rules, and legitimacy. And in the criminal world, legitimacy is a rare currency. This made his approval worth more than ever. Prison officials soon realized they were not dealing with a typical inmate. He wasn't starting fights or smuggling contraband. He was patient, composed, dangerous in silence. Luciano understood that brute force meant nothing in a place where everyone was already confined. Influence, not violence, was his weapon. Yet even as he maintained control, Luciano began to reflect. The quiet of the cell stripped away the distractions of nightclubs, brothels, and political meetings. For the first time since he was a kid running the streets of New York, he was forced to face himself. He thought of the risks he had taken, the men he had trusted, the empire he had built. Power had always been his language. But now, in the stillness, he began to see the cost of it. The underworld was changing too. New figures were rising. Younger gangsters, more reckless, less disciplined, were pushing for power. The FBI was evolving, using surveillance and wiretaps, shifting the battlefield from street corners to courtrooms. Luciano saw that his empire would need to adapt or perish. And even from his cell, he began to strategize for the Mafia's survival in a new era. Then came an unexpected twist: the Second World War. As the United States entered the conflict, its ports, especially in New York, became crucial to the war effort. But they were also vulnerable. Sabotage, espionage, and dockside chaos became a real fear. The government needed order. And ironically, the man who had built his fortune through crime was about to become an asset in defending the nation. Authorities reached out indirectly, understanding the delicate optics. Through intermediaries, Luciano was approached to assist in securing the docks against Axis sabotage. He agreed, not out of patriotism but out of calculation. By cooperating, he saw a path toward freedom. Luciano still had deep influence on the docks through his network of longshoremen, unions, and the underworld. His cooperation was invaluable. Operation Underworld, the government's quiet alliance with mobsters, became a secret chapter in American history. Luciano's network helped maintain order in the ports, reduced sabotage risks, and even aided intelligence gathering in Sicily. To the outside world he was a prisoner. But to the U.S. military he was suddenly an ally. This unexpected collaboration changed everything. Luciano's name began to circulate not just in criminal files, but in classified intelligence reports. Powerful men who had once cheered his imprisonment now saw him differently, as someone useful. And in the American system, usefulness often outweighs morality. Inside prison, Luciano's confidence grew again. He had endured humiliation, adapted, and now found leverage. He didn't need to escape. He could wait. Time, as always, would bend in favor of power. But these years also hardened him. His trust became narrower, his patience more strategic. Friends on the outside were not always loyal. Some had grown too comfortable in their positions. Power without his physical presence meant others could make their own moves. He watched from afar, planning not revenge, but a reassertion of his authority when the right moment came. Evenings in prison often ended the same way. Luciano would sit in his cell, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of the prison settling down for the night. The walls didn't intimidate him anymore. They reminded him of the world he had once controlled, and could still influence. In many ways, prison had become a mirror. It showed him what he had built, what he had lost, and what remained. Lucky Luciano was not just surviving his sentence. He was rewriting what power meant for a gangster. No longer just a man in expensive suits and nightclubs, he had transformed into something more dangerous. A legend who didn't need to be free to rule. When freedom finally came, it didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, negotiated in back rooms and whispered between powerful men who owed Lucky Luciano more than they'd ever admit. After nearly a decade behind bars, his cooperation during the war had made him valuable again. And in 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had once built his career by destroying Luciano, signed the papers that commuted his sentence. The irony was almost poetic. Dewey justified the decision as a reward for wartime assistance. But both men knew it was something else. A transaction between two power brokers who understood the rules of leverage. Luciano didn't walk back into America as a free man. His freedom came with a price: deportation to Italy. He had lived most of his life in the U.S., yet now he was no longer welcome there. On February 9, 1946, he boarded a military transport ship under heavy guard, leaving behind the city that had made him and destroyed him. As the New York skyline faded into the fog, Luciano reportedly said quietly, "They can take me out of America, but they can't take America out of me." When he arrived in Naples, he was greeted not with hostility but curiosity. The Italian press called him Il Re del Crimen, the king of crime. To the local authorities he was both a threat and a legend. To the black market dealers and small-time gangsters of post-war Italy, he was a god. Italy in 1946 was chaotic, poverty-stricken, rebuilding, and crawling with opportunity. For a mind like Luciano's, it was fertile ground. At first he tried to live quietly. He bought a villa in Naples and surrounded himself with a few loyal friends. But a man like Luciano could never simply fade into the background. Within months, reports surfaced that he was meeting with Sicilian Mafia leaders. Men who were rebuilding their own organizations after the fascist regime had shattered them. The old Cosa Nostra had survived in fragments, and Luciano understood how to connect those fragments into something powerful again. His influence spread quietly. He helped establish links between the Sicilian Mafia and American organized crime, ensuring that the transatlantic drug trade, heroin and morphine shipped through Italy, flowed smoothly. It was risky but profitable. Luciano didn't need to be in New York to control it. Communication, contacts, and fear did the work for him. His network stretched from Palermo to Havana, from Naples to New York. By 1947 he was drawn once again to the familiar scent of American ambition, this time through Cuba. With the help of Meyer Lansky, he arranged to move there discreetly, hoping to regain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Havana at that time was a paradise for gamblers, mobsters, and exiles. Casinos flourished under the protection of Fulgencio Batista's government. For a brief moment, it seemed Luciano was poised to reclaim a shadow version of his former empire. In December 1946, a lavish meeting was held at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, one of the most famous gatherings in Mafia history. Nearly every major American mob boss attended: Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, and others. Luciano, dressed impeccably, presided like a monarch returning to his court. The gathering discussed gambling operations, narcotics routes, and the future of organized crime. Even though he had been exiled, Lucky Luciano was once again the center of power. But the illusion didn't last. Authorities learned of his presence in Cuba and pressured the Batista government to expel him. Within months he was put on a plane and sent back to Italy. His return marked the final severing of his physical connection to America. He was free but never truly home. Back in Naples, Luciano's health began to decline. The years of stress, prison life, and constant pressure had taken their toll. Yet, his mind remained sharp. He lived simply but never completely withdrew. He still entertained visitors, businessmen, gangsters, and even journalists curious about the man behind the myth. To some, he offered charm and advice. To others, he offered warnings. "Power," he once said to a young visitor, "is like a glass of wine. Hold it too tight and you spill it. Hold it too loose and someone else drinks it." The world around him had changed. The Mafia was evolving into a multinational business empire, but its heart, its discipline, structure, and methods, all traced back to him. Luciano had given the underworld its modern face, and though exiled, he remained its ghostly architect. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack at the Naples airport. He was 64. Ironically, he had been meeting a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Even in death, the myth was feeding itself. The legend of the man who had built an empire, ruled from the shadows, and redefined what organized crime meant. They buried him in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, New York, the same soil he had been banished from. In the end, he came home after all. Thousands attended his funeral. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity, but all recognized one thing: Lucky Luciano had changed the underworld forever. In exile, he had become something more than a gangster. He was a symbol of ambition, control, and the thin line between order and corruption. His exile had not broken him, it had crystallized his legend. From the docks of New York to the villas of Naples, his shadow stretched across 2 continents. Even in death, the name Lucky Luciano whispered of a man who understood one truth better than anyone else: power never really dies, it just changes hands. Lucky Luciano's legacy isn't written in law books or history classrooms. It lives in the invisible architecture of power, in the codes, structures, and unwritten laws that govern organized crime to this day. He didn't invent the Mafia, but he redefined it. Before him, it was a scattered, blood-soaked network of gangs ruled by brute force and revenge. After him, it became an institution, sleek, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. His greatest creation wasn't his empire of vice. It was the system that allowed crime to operate like business and power to move like currency. To understand Luciano's legacy, one must first understand what he replaced. The old Mafia was tribal, Sicilian-born, clannish, bound by superstition and pride. It was a world where family loyalty outweighed profit, where disputes were settled with bullets, and alliances crumbled as quickly as they were made. Luciano saw the weakness in that. He was part of a new generation of immigrants, Americanized, pragmatic, and ambitious. For him, power wasn't about tradition, it was about control. He saw that chaos wasted money, and that violence without purpose was bad for business. So he stripped the Mafia of its old romanticism and rebuilt it with a corporate soul. His greatest innovation, the Commission, was more than a council of mob bosses. It was a parliament of crime. It institutionalized negotiation and governance, replacing vendettas with votes. Under Luciano's vision, the underworld mirrored Wall Street, divided territories, profit-sharing, and mutual protection. Murders became business decisions. Wars became mergers. It was ruthless efficiency wrapped in ritual. And even decades after his death, the Commission remained the silent foundation of American organized crime. But Luciano's genius went beyond structure. It was psychological. He understood human nature: fear, ambition, loyalty, and greed. He built systems that exploited all four. His men didn't just obey him because they feared him. They obeyed because they believed in the order he promised. To them, Luciano was not just a boss, he was the embodiment of balance. Too much chaos and everyone lost. Too much control and rebellion brewed. Luciano knew how to walk that razor's edge better than anyone. That psychological sophistication is what separates him from most gangsters in history. He didn't need to shout or threaten. He simply made himself indispensable. Judges, politicians, police officers, and businessmen, they all found a way to orbit his world. To some, he offered money. To others, protection. And to the most powerful, he offered discretion. His influence crept into the upper layers of society until the lines between the legitimate and the criminal blurred into one seamless reality. Even after his fall, his ideas outlived him. When, or made decisions, they did so in the framework Luciano had built. When the Mafia expanded into Las Vegas, Cuba, and even Europe, it followed the template he had drawn. Even the language of organized crime, the hierarchy, the families, the notion of a national syndicate, all of it was his invention. But his legacy extends beyond the Mafia. Luciano became a metaphor for power itself, the kind that hides behind respectability, that manipulates systems instead of defying them. His story forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth, that corruption isn't always violent or crude. Sometimes it wears a suit, speaks politely, and sits in the front row of the theater. Luciano showed that the machinery of control, legal or illegal, works the same way. In many ways, Lucky Luciano was the Godfather before the Godfather, not just in influence but in psychology. The cool restraint of Don Vito Corleone, the corporate structure of Michael, the balance between family and empire, all of it reflects the man who turned the Mafia into a brand. Hollywood later romanticized what Luciano had lived, but the truth beneath the myth remains colder. He didn't rule through love or nostalgia. He ruled through logic, and that made him truly dangerous. Yet, his story is also a paradox. For all his brilliance, he could never escape the consequences of his ambition. He built an empire on control only to lose control of his own life. His fall wasn't dramatic, it was inevitable. Because no man, no matter how clever, can master a system built on fear forever. Eventually, fear consumes its creator. Still, there's an eerie immortality in the way his name endures. Modern criminal networks, from drug cartels to cybercrime rings, still operate on the principles Luciano pioneered: structure, discipline, diversification, and deniability. He was the first to understand that crime could be globalized, long before the term existed. The digital age has replaced bootleg whiskey with data theft, but the business model remains the same. Luciano's ghost lives in every shadow economy that thrives today. When we speak of Lucky Luciano, we are really speaking of transformation, of how a street kid from Sicily turned the chaos of the criminal underworld into an empire that mirrored legitimate power. He blurred the moral lines between outlaw and executive, between order and corruption, between justice and control. In that sense, his legacy is not confined to history, it seeps into the present, into every system where profit outweighs principle. In the end, Lucky Luciano's story isn't just about crime, it's about human nature. It's about the hunger for order in chaos, the seduction of control, and the price of ambition. He was both architect and prisoner of his own creation, a man who tamed anarchy only to be consumed by it. And in that contradiction, that perfect balance of genius and downfall, his legend remains eternal. In the final reckoning, Lucky Luciano's story is neither triumph nor tragedy, it is both. His life embodies the paradox of power, the ability to build something vast, disciplined, and enduring, yet lose it all in pursuit of control. From the immigrant slums of New York to the marble halls of Havana hotels and the sunlit streets of Naples, Luciano's shadow stretched across nations and generations. He began as a hustler chasing survival and ended as a strategist whose ideas would shape global crime for a century. History remembers him through a dual lens: the myth and the man. The myth is seductive, the calm, elegant mastermind who could command armies without raising his voice. The man, however, was haunted by exile, isolation, and the knowledge that every empire, even one built in the shadows, eventually collapses under its own weight. His genius lay not in violence but in vision. He saw the underworld as a reflection of society itself, governed by rules, ambition, and human weakness. In the end, Luciano's true legacy is not written in the blood of his rivals or the fortune he amassed, but in the mirror he held up to civilization. He forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that corruption and power often share the same language, whether spoken in boardrooms or back alleys. The systems he built outlived him, not because they were criminal but because they were efficient, a chilling testament to how easily order can serve darkness. When he died, his body returned to New York, buried under the same skyline that had once crowned him king. The crowds that gathered didn't just mourn a gangster, they mourned an era. An age of whispered deals, silent codes, and men who ruled without faces. Lucky Luciano may have been buried in the earth, but the world he created never truly went away. In every story of ambition and downfall, in every balance between morality and power, his ghost still lingers, a quiet reminder that true control always comes with a price.